Hey, hey, it's big news at the Talking Joe Studios. We have our first ever guest. Cue the fanfare and the marching band. This guy has worked for IDW, Marvel, Boom Studios, Valiant, Image. He's a writer, artist, letterer, colorist. I guess he does his own books, so maybe he edits his own stuff. That's, of course, the great Michel Fiffe. How are you, sir?
Hey, what's going on, Chief? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're most welcome. You're most welcome. Our first guest, like I say, it's big news at the Talking Joe Studios.
That's an honor, I gotta tell you.
How are you doing on this fine? Well, I guess it's your morning. It's my afternoon. How are you doing?
Good. Just taking a break from inking a bunch of pages. I'm on my next project, so I'm always at the board, just working away.
Ooh, interesting. Is that some COPRA stuff or some stuff you can't talk about?
A little bit of both. I'm always
Okay.
trying to juggle as much as I possibly can, but definitely COPRA.
Yeah, nice. We're going to talk about
like
G.I.
you said,
Joe.
it's just me writing, penciling, doing it all. So right now, I'm in the current inking stage right now.
Okay. Is that? I mean, it's always, I like the movie Mallrats, Kevin Smith, and there's that good shtick with Jason Lee where he's like, "Inker, you're a tracer," and all that sort of stuff. And it wasn't until I kind of grew up that I realised that inking, man, that is a fine skill. It's not simply going over the pencils, is it? It's,
No, not at all. I mean, basically, I'm tracing myself, you could say, but
yeah.
Actually, I do most of my drawing in the inking stage. My pencils are usually pretty loose. I mean, they're like scratchy shapes, that only I understand. And sometimes I even test my own limits. So usually when I'm inking is when I'm actually figuring things out the way they're going to look. I just have something in mind and I go for it.
It can even kind of change what you'd originally envisioned when you were doing the pencils.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, and a good solid inker traditionally does that. They were given kind of loose pencils because they had to crank out pages, as a factory system, just kind of get the basic shapes on the page, and then the inker would be responsible for tightening it up and making it production ready. These days, it's a different ballgame with not only digital inking, but the way pencilers sort of pencil so tightly, so meticulously, that it's just almost a different art form.
So
but
how do
I lean
you
more towards a traditional side?
So you are a pen and ink man rather than a digital man, or you use multimedia?
I definitely use brushes and nibs to ink. For coloring, I use color pencils, paints, watercolors, whatever I have around, and some digital. We still have to scan the pages and send them in. So I do a little bit of cleanup in that, because my originals could get messy sometimes. I do edits on the actual pages, so I do a little bit of digital. So I try to do it all.
Yeah, I mean we've jumped straight in there, balls deep. So we're going to talk about G.I. Joe, obviously, but let's go back. 25 years. A young Michel, you're kicking around at home. Is there comics about in the house? Were they part of your growing up? And at what point did you think, what, I'm going to make a living from these funny books?
Oh yeah, comics were always around. I always liked them. I always drew them. I'd say when I was about 7 or 8 is when I kind of wanted to start doing it forever. The concept of a career and a job, I think, was something that was asked in school. Like, what would you like to do? And comics was my natural answer. And, cut to now, and that's what I'm doing. So I'm living out that sort of fantasy. I'm really fortunate to be doing that. But comics were always around. That was never a weird thing. That was never, it wasn't lacking. It was a reading tool. It's what, that's how I learned how to read English, between that and like cartoons. That set me well on my path to what I'm doing now,
Was there anything, excuse me, was there anything that, was a staple comic that you read, or was it anything you could consume, anything that was on the newsstand?
Well, for me, I was sort of like at the mercy of whatever my local 7-Eleven ordered. So I would pick from what they had, and I had favorites. Daredevil was a favorite. Suicide Squad was a favorite. Batman was always like a must-get. I was a big Batman fan. Superman. It wasn't until I started going to comic book shops, still as a young kid, but after developing some sort of taste, when I started like broadening my horizons and getting other stuff. And around that time, that's sort of when Image started. So I started getting those.
Yep.
I saw, for example, this was big. It seems minor, but it's not. But the documentary Comic Book Confidential aired, and that opened me up to a world of comic books. I mean, a golden age, independence. I mean, it was great. It was awesome. So that's sort of, I don't know. They've always been around. Comics have always been part of my DNA of the entertainment that I like and the art that I like.
Yeah, cool. I mean, we in the UK we had a lot of weeklies, which is kind of opposed to the US model of monthly. So we had stuff like comics called The Beano and the Dandy, which were aimed at a much younger audience, but there was also Battle and Battle Action, which were kind of heavy war military comics. And it wasn't really until sort of late 70s, 1997, when 2000 AD came out, and it kind of, which is still going now. And know, if you haven't caught any of that, then I think it'd be right up your alley. It's not just Judge Dredd.
I love Judge Dredd. I have not read any recent ones, but I do know that it's still going on, man.
I mean, that shit's still going. I mean, it just celebrated 40 years a couple of years ago, and to produce a weekly comic on schedule, for that period of time is wow. It's that and G.I. Joe. 2000 AD and G.I. Joe are my two comics lovers. If you said, you can't read any other comic titles but two, those would be the two for me. So
now, when you got G.I. Joe, was that Action Force? Was that the British equivalent?
Yeah, you nailed it there. Right? So we got it in 1987. We got a weekly book called Action Force. It only ran for 50 issues for a year, and it, from like issue 2 or 3, it started reprinting the US stuff as well as UK original stories using those characters. But it actually started reprinting from about issue 25 solidly upwards of 25 of G.I. Joe upwards. So when I went back and bought all the US comics, that 1 to 24 was all new stuff to me. But we've actually, in our reread on the Talking Joe podcast, we've just hit 27, The Origin of Snake Eyes, which I know you're a fan of that story.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I've only read one Grant Morrison story that came out in Action Force. That's the only stuff.
The Quick Kick one.
Yes. Well, was it Quick Kick?
Oh, the Shang-Chi.
There was a Storm Shadow short story.
Really?
I believe, or maybe Storm Shadow was in the on the cover. I'm pretty sure it's a story. This was a while back, but I was recently introduced to the work of Jerry Paris.
Okay,
and he's amazing. I had no idea who he was, and I just learned about him like weeks ago. But he was a staple in G.I. Joe Action Force comics, and so now I have to look for those. I'm on the hunt for those.
That's probably the Battle Action, is it possibly? Because there was also before Action Force in 1987, and I don't know too much about this myself, and there's a lot of other people that will correct me or give us the right information on this pod probably. But there was another weekly comic called Battle, then went to Battle Action, and it was kind of that real crappy newspaper print, almost like toilet roll kind of paper, and that also used the G.I. Joe characters but in an out of continuity kind of setting.
Right.
So maybe that was where that Grant Morrison popped up.
Yeah, maybe. I wouldn't know. I'm not the authority on that stuff, but and again, I was recently introduced to some of it because of the back issue market here in the States.
Yeah.
But G.I. Joe comics specifically, I had a few of them when I was a kid, but it wasn't until I was like an older reader collecting the issues and specifically the work of Larry Hama.
Yes.
I read these as a young adult, essentially. So I don't have like a nostalgic bent to this material. I read it as an adult who had already read tons of comics.
Yeah.
And I sort of just got swept up in it, As a kid, though, I did have some toys. I watched the cartoons all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, it was really the comics that came later.
Yeah, I started seriously collecting US comics in about 1992, around that. So I was 17 at the time. So I was late developer, if you will, as well as in terms of hardcore collecting. And
right.
I remember sending off to East Coast Comics and getting big batches of 30 or 40 G.I. Joes at a time. And then I was found some comic book stores in the UK, and that's when I started getting all the Image books. It was a great time because those guys are broken away, and I was slap bang in that boom period, and wow, that image stuff was still holds up. I love it.
I was in the middle of that too. Yeah, I bought every single Image comic that came out. I was the prime demographic for that stuff.
Yeah,
sure.
you know it. That's amazing. I mean, let's quickly talk about. We're going to talk about your Sierra Muerte and other stuff, G.I. Joe. But I do want to quickly touch on, a couple of other books you've done, COPRA especially. Couple of apologies quickly. First of all, that Ben couldn't be here because he is doing some work in New York City. Hopefully he'll be back tomorrow. And secondly, I know you've been doing a lot of PR lately, other podcasts, so I apologise if you're getting the same questions thrown at you. But there might be people who are listening to this that might not listen to the other ones. So
yeah, of course.
But yeah, COPRA, I mean, that's your independent book that you pretty much have a free reign and do everything on. So just tell the listeners, if they haven't caught it, what's the crack with that?
That's right. COPRA was, it still is, the serialized action comic that I do. I've been self-publishing it for about 6 years, and I'm up to issue 31. And it's like I said, it's my action comic. It's the one I completely create and produce myself, from writing it to coloring it to self-publishing and shipping it to subscribers and stores all across the country, and in some international stores too. Some stores in the UK carry it. Bergen Street Comics do the collected editions, and they have a wider distribution system within Previews and Diamond, and so it's available. But the basic premise is just my version of like weird misfit mercenaries going around doing stuff. It's my love letter to adventure comics, the way I want them to be. And look, it's, some would say that it's like an indie take on it. I can't really put it apart like that because it's just the way I draw. But I do like drawing it in a different way. I like the fact that it doesn't look like anything else. That's just sort of an automatic thing. But looking back, it just looks different, and it reads differently. So it's not like an homage to anything specific, but it's just the way I want a superhero action comic to read and feel and engage with the reader. It's a relationship. Yeah. So it's something that I've developed over the years with my readers, who have been super loyal and awesome. And I try to reward those long-term readers while at the same time being inviting for a new audience.
Yeah, I mean, I came to it late. I mean, I listened to the War Rocket Ajax podcast, and Chris and Matt on there. Yeah. Your name comes up quite a bit and how much they like it. And it wasn't until the Bloodstrike book came out from Image that I read that, because that I had big ties to that book growing up, and I thought, I'll check out this COPRA book as well. And it was like, holy shit, this is ticking all the boxes. So I went on eBay to try and find it, and it's a sign of a good book, because those early issues, man, they are cash money if you want to buy them on eBay. Which is a good sign. I guess the print run was small, but Comixology is your friend, so.
Right. By virtue of the fact that it was limited editions, there are only so many copies I could print. It does make it a collectible. Those early issues, especially, I could only afford to print, say, 300 to 400 copies. Yeah. And I thought I would be sitting on copies forever. I'd still have back issues. But it picked up, and thanks to guys and readers like the War Rocket Ajax guys who liked it early on, that it just, by word of mouth, it spread and it hit, and it's been great ever since. And I've been trying to develop this huge story that I'm still continuing to this day.
So what's the I'm nowhere near the end. I'm only up to issue I think 10. But is there an end goal in sight, or there's obviously lots of plots and subplots interweaved, and or is it just as long as people keep buying it, you'll keep doing it?
I mean, I've flirted with that idea, but it started out as it was only going to be 12 issues originally, but by issue 2, I was having such a good time. I felt like, how could I continue this without milking it? Because that's what I don't want to do. I don't want it to be some sort of unenthusiastic enterprise for me and the reader, right? Yeah. So I mapped out 50 issues, I'd say, give or take, where I could do a little bit less or more, but I could easily fill 50 issues and say exactly what I want to say with these characters. Cool. And maybe along the line, I will develop more stories and flesh them out and just add it, and just the thing will grow. So it's organic in that regard, but I have 50 issues in mind, and right now I'm a little past the halfway point for that goal. But it kind of sprang as this sort of this organic, spontaneous thing, this kind of response to my own work, which I usually, I took forever to create. It didn't have any sort of superheroics or any sort of ridiculous scenarios in them, which is the stuff I like as well. But it kind of came from that frustration, and I've been doing it by myself ever since. Because, the world of alternative comics and indie comics, that's sort of what you do. You don't think about it. You just kind of do it. There are collaborators, of course, but it's not that weird that one person does everything.
So is that not in a negative way, but is that kind of a lonely thing? Do you I guess you're doing other projects where you are working with people, but
it can be, but it's not for me. It's kind of my preferred way of doing it. I've been in studios before, but those situations are more distracting than not. And at the clip I go to produce the amount of stuff I have to just get done, I just have to be left alone, not in terms of like feedback or editors or anything, but just physically I need to just let loose and just go and crank stuff out.
Yeah. I've been
go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was just gonna say that it's not quite lonely. It's actually perfect.
Yeah. I've been watching a lot of I got a kick out of a lot of 80s and 90s action movies. I just watched Passenger 57 yesterday, the old Wesley Snipes, and it's it's so bad it's good. I really dig that scene, and I get that vibe from COPRA, and not that it's so bad it's good, but it's so good it's good. But I like that just overblown action and outrageous characters and all those Stallone and Schwarzenegger movies from the 80s and 90s. I love it, and I get that vibe from your work, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's what I like. So I try to inject that into the comics. Not only that, but like other types of comics too, not just superhero comics. That's why it looks the way it does. Because I'm not drawing from the same pool of influences that a lot of cartoonists currently dominating the landscape have. That's why there's even though there's a lot of variety in a lot of comics. Maybe it's the coloring, maybe it's the subject matter, but there's sort of a sameness that sets in, and I automatically just come from a different place, so it sets it apart visually and thematically. It's just my own interests. The way I tell a story is way different than the current traditional crop of comics.
Definitely.
So I'm glad to hear that you dig it. That you got into it by way of Bloodstrike.
Yeah. We're going to have a little interlude here, not a silent interlude. It's a G.I. Joe pop quiz. It's a G.I. Joe pop quiz. Question 1. You don't know what to do. It's a lazy Saturday. You pop down to the local basketball court for a quick pickup game. You got 1 second left in the game. You're down by 1. You need a clutch buzzer beater to win the game. Who takes the shot? Is it clutch or is it buzzer?
I'll go with clutch.
Clutch? Yeah. Clutch in the clutch?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Back to the show. Weren't expecting that, were you? Bloodstrike. So this is, for people that don't know, this was an Image book back in the 90s. It was from the Extreme Studios, from Rob Liefeld, coming out of Youngblood and all that kind of stuff. And it kind of abruptly ended. I think for Bloodstrike and Brigade, I think I only got up to about issue 10. I got whole runs of Youngblood back in my parents' house, but when this came out, it was a 3-issue miniseries that came out last year. Bloodstrike Brutalists or Brutalists? How would you pronounce it?
Brutalists, yeah.
Brutalists, okay. And it kind of plugs in a couple of... COPRA is a book that you can pick up and, run with without much prior knowledge, but Bloodstrike, man, this is balls deep in terms of... There's characters that are mentioned that you might not know what's going on, but having said that, I've changed my mind there mid-sentence. I think even though I couldn't remember a lot of the characters, I did follow the story, which is obviously the mark of good storytelling. But, this picks up from that original run. Or
yeah,
it plugs in a couple of missing issues, because they had a weird thing, didn't they, where they, around issue 10, they published issue 25. It was almost like a future events, and then the idea was the storytellers would build up month by month up to this issue 25. It was a really cool idea. I had the Stormwatch one as well.
Yeah.
And but it stopped. But it stopped on issue 22, and then you've come along and you've kind of filled in the blanks with issue 23 and 24.
Right, because I'm an anal fanboy, and I just need those plot elements to be wrapped up. Because as a fan of that stuff, I wondered the same things, like what happened to these characters and what happened to that situation. And I was rereading that stuff, and I was thinking, what if I just did that myself, and what if I could reach out to Rob and ask him if it'd be cool if I did it.
Oh shit, so you actually reached out to him and said, look, I want to finish this story off.
Oh yeah, no, specifically, and make it a 3-parter, and the first part being the issue 0, which Bloodstrike never got. Brigade has a 0, Youngblood has a 0, everyone pretty much got a 0 except for Bloodstrike. So I figured if I could plug in those holes, give them the number 0, make it a 3-parter, I could sort of use it as a showcase of as many Rob Liefeld properties as I can, while wrapping up those old plot threads. So that was a balance. So it could be an overload of information if you're not familiar with the characters and stuff, because I treat it just like straight. Like I'm not gonna take time and explain from the ground up, because I have a limited amount of space. I have 3 issues.
Yeah,
to tell
like I said,
the older story.
I think I had the first 10 issues, and so then when I read your mini, obviously the 0 is kind of like that sort of origin stuff. But then even reading 23 and 24, I didn't need to have read 11 to 22. It did make sense because I did remember those characters, and 24 was probably my favourite. That cover, oh man, that cover, it's very Sam Keith-ish,
I love Sam Keith.
Yeah. And, the bits with Deadlock and Foreplay where they're kind of blacked out and scratchy, and that bit where she's cutting the guy in half with the swords, oh man, that's choice stuff right there.
Well, thanks, man. I'm glad you dig that. Now, the thing is, I mean, not to give anything away about the original run, no spoilers, but it was a team book for the first 10 issues, and then it turned into like a solo book. And so that's almost like a different title that has very little to do with the previous 10 issues, just for your listeners, just so they can know the context of what Bloodstrike was. So I had to marry those 2 elements, because they didn't in the original run. Now, I don't think the book was canceled. I think they just kept going with a new number 1. They did that mini called Assassin, Bloodstrike Assassin, and another one-shot. Gotcha. And they never touched upon those 2 missing issues, even though they told us, they're coming. 23 and 24 are coming. And then they never did. So as a fan, I'm like, I wanted those stories. And so luckily Rob was cool enough to let me do my COPRA thing on it, which is to say I drew, colored, lettered everything, and I managed the whole thing. I got a bunch of my buddies to do backups. So instead of having ads, we have cool future ads for comics that may or may not come out. You know what I mean?
That was nice. That was nice.
Guys like Chuck Forsman do a comic in the as a back cover instead of just having like another house ad. I wanted this item to be an artifact that's cool enough to keep, to have, and to hold, to collect, just to not have it be typical. I wanted it to be like a cool thing that lives on its own. Every issue too. I wanted every issue to kind of to be enjoyable on its own merit. Obviously it's going to be a 3-parter, so read together, hopefully that's a satisfying thing. But I just pay attention to all these little things. I try to make the individual comic as satisfying as possible, as opposed to like writing for the trade or waiting for like a hardcover collection down the line. I try to make these comics to be like short bursts, intense bursts of information.
Am I right in thinking as well on your website there's a you do a bit of a deep dive on Bloodstrike as well if people want to get
they could go to my site, just my name, michelfiffe.com, and I have a retrospective on the day the first issue came out 25 years later. I posted this huge retrospective on where Bloodstrike came from, where they've been, the cameos they've appeared in.
Cool.
And I go pretty deep on it, So that's a good companion to the book,
Yeah,
because I
nice.
touch upon all the things that happen to the characters in the story. So it also served as a refresher for older readers or new readers if they've never even heard of Bloodstrike. So I think it worked.
If you're looking at that image, just that line quickly that came out of those original 7, if you had to pick a favourite team book, Silvestri's Cyberforce, Lee's Wildcats, Rob's Youngblood, or Wals's Wetworks, what was your favourite choice of those team books?
Oh, Youngblood all the way.
All the way, yeah.
Youngblood all the way, yeah. Freak Force comes a close second.
Really? Yeah, Freak Force, I remember that, yeah.
I like Freak Force because I'm a big Savage Dragon fan.
Okay.
And I like the artist on that, Vic Bridges. I love those stories.
Okay.
They're plotted largely by Keith Giffen.
Yeah.
But the Youngblood title, that was my favorite title. I actually collected it and read it and followed it and was excited every time a new issue would come out, as opposed to, say, Cyberforce, which I only got the first issue and I never really followed it. Wildcats, I made it to maybe issue 3.
Yep.
I like those artists. I really like those artists. I mean, Silvestri's one of the best, and Jim Lee's great too. But the books themselves, it was difficult to get hot for. You know what I mean? Youngblood, it was for me.
Who was your favourite Youngblood character?
Man, I always gravitate to Die Hard. I love Die Hard.
He was cool as shit, Die Hard, yeah.
He was great, and they tried fleshing him out later when Eric Stevenson was writing the second volume, and Roger Cruz was drawing it.
Yeah.
That run is underrated because Roger Cruz is a great artist.
He apes that kind of Joe Mad style a little bit in the beginning, didn't he? But then he kind of developed his own style.
Exactly, right. At first it was like just a Joe Mad riff, and that's fine too. That's beautiful. But he really came into his own during that run, and the stories start shaping up too. I mean, Eric Stevenson should be given credit for like trying to mold something specific there, trying to rein it all in. And so I love all those comics. So my pick would be Youngblood all the way.
Cool. It's a G.I. Joe pop quiz. It's a G.I. Joe pop quiz. Question 2.
Love these.
It's a lazy Sunday afternoon. You're going down to the local chili cook-off. Who is going to be able to eat the hottest chili? Is it Roadblock or is it Sergeant Slaughter?
I got to give it to Roadblock, man.
Yeah?
Come on.
I know he's the chef and all that, but I mean,
he's the
Slaughter
chef.
looks mean.
He's got to handle it. Come on.
Yeah.
Come on, Sergeant Slaughter. I mean, I dig him, but he's a visitor. Roadblock is like, he's family, man.
All right. Yeah. Cool. Digging that. All right. Okay. So let's move on to the project, which is coming out next week. G.I. Joe fans are excited about this. The 3-issue miniseries, G.I. Joe Sierra Muerte. How did that come about?
Yes, indeed. How did that come about? I wanted to work on G.I. Joe, essentially. I mean, I've been wanting to work with IDW specifically for a while now, and they had G.I. Joe, and that was just the perfect fit. Funnily enough, I did some G.I. Joe samples well over a decade ago, just trying to be like an art robot, like just a work for hire, just please have me draw something. So I did some G.I. Joe samples because
now these are on your book. I saw these on your website. So when you say excuse me, when you say you were doing these, what was the ambition? Like you say, I guess was just to become an artist on any G.I. Joe project, was it? Or
or anything that they would have, but hopefully G.I. Joe, because that was the property that I felt suited to draw, as opposed to something like Transformers, where it would be more of a struggle for me. It wasn't a natural fit. And although I did my own comics back then, my own independent stories, I still wanted a job. I still wanted to develop a career drawing, even just penciling. I wasn't, I didn't have to ink. So I did these samples based on these just characters, just tell a story of everything I would want to draw. So I threw in Snake Eye, Storm Shadow, Destro, Baroness, in as many, put as much stuff in as few pages as possible, just because it's a sample. You don't want to give them a graphic novel, you just want to show them that you could draw. But I got swamped. Nothing came of it. It cut to me now, being let loose on the franchise, which is great. Doing my COPRA thing, which is just pretty much handpicking what characters I want to use.
Cool.
Throughout the history of the G.I. Joe comics history.
So
it's been a blast.
Cool. I mean, what was your introduction to GI Joe? I know you said back at the beginning that you were always reading comics, but you maybe came to the GI Joe a bit later. What do you remember? Not saying what was the first GI Joe comic you read, unless you can remember it. But do you know what era, what kind of stage in the run?
Well, the very first comic, GI Joe comic I read was Special Missions number 11. However, that was one of my very first comics, and that unfortunately got eclipsed by my love for Batman and Suicide Squad and Daredevil, which was my introduction to those characters as well. So I really gravitated towards that, not so much into G.I. Joe, though I liked the cartoons and I had some of the toys. But like I said, as an older reader, that I got hooked by Larry Hama's work in general, specifically G.I. Joe. And I don't remember the issue. It might have been around... It was a Mark Bright drawn issue of Snake Eyes. Okay. It was, I think, issue 104.
That's the one where they
him infiltrate. Yeah. And I just loved it. I mean, it was brisk, but it was meaty. There was a lot to it.
Mark Bright is underrated as an artist, isn't he? I mean,
super underrated. And I loved him from like Green Lantern and Batman stuff and his work at Milestone. But I never knew that he drew G.I. Joe, and then I thought it was a fill-in issue. But I loved the story so much, I just started buying back issues, and I discovered that he had a good chunk of comics, and I don't understand why they're so underrated. Maybe it's because it's a franchise comic, and you know, people only really talk about like the silent interlude or the first few issues that are classic. But people
forget as well.
So good.
People forget as well around sort of 85 and 86, when the comic was like 3 or 4 years old, it was outselling X-Men. It was Marvel's #1 book.
Yeah. That's right. It was G.I. Joe and X-Men back neck and neck.
Yeah. I mean, and obviously, they kind of the industry kind of suggests that if you're a toy franchise comic, you've probably got 2 years tops before cancellation, and those toys make way for new toys, and your comic book's going off the cliff. But I mean, to do 155 issues, okay, admittedly towards the end the sales maybe weren't so good, but 155 issues of a toy franchise, and then 10 years later to resurrect it, or more than 10 years later to resurrect it and do another 100 issues is a big achievement.
Yeah, I think it's tradition to put not your best people on franchise properties. That's just the way it goes. Right. You put your top talent on the bigger books. And so thankfully, because of that, Larry Hama got his chance to start his first regular writing gig on G.I. Joe and slowly develop it into this thing. I mean, he is the voice of G.I. Joe. It's nothing else. It's his voice. It's his vision. And the fact that it went that long is a testament to that, because they could have easily just canceled it, especially at the height of the crunch, when the bubble burst. It could have gone away. But he held on to it, even while he was writing Avengers and writing Wolverine. Yep. And he increased the sales on Wolverine too, but they never gave him credit for that either, for some weird reason.
That's a good run as well. That's a good run.
It's a great run. Yeah. It's especially him and Silvestri that's like such, and Dan Green as the inker, that's such a potent combination. It's fantastic.
And then it was Adam Kubert. Adam Kubert came on as well, I think. Was it after that?
Eventually, yeah, he came on when Mark Silvestri went to Image. Yeah. But Larry Hama held it down for a long time, specifically for G.I. Joe. That's
and he started doing kind of the Chris Claremont thing of having all these subplots, and you start to not be able to tell where the story is ending and a new one's beginning. It's just one long soap opera of and it's not to be outside. I was chatting to a friend the other day, and he's not into G.I. Joe, and he said, that's that G.I. Joe kids thing. And I'm like, you look at these, it's not a kids thing. You look at these in-depth stories, and there's war, there's drama, there's politics, there's humor, there's romance. I mean, Larry does it all.
Yeah, he got away with a lot for a mainstream comic. He really injected adult themes and politics, tons of politics. Into these comics and into essentially a war comic book, where he couldn't really show too much violence, but he couldn't ignore it, the way the cartoon sort of had to. kind of dance around the fact that these people were being murdered and their lives were actually in
Yeah.
danger.
Yeah, yeah.
But he also never forgot the fact that it's a comic book that has a ninja, that has ninjas, that has guys like Serpentor in that universe, just very comic booky concepts integrated with a real knowledge, real military know-how.
Yeah.
The only difference between him and someone like, say, Claremont was that I think Hama had a larger challenge in the fact that he was given new characters all the time,
Yep.
unpredictably. Just like, here's a new season, here's the new crop of toys, here's the new Cobra Commander armor. Work with it.
Yep. Yep.
And he did, and he did great with it.
On the last episode of the pod, we covered this briefly. That I think it was from the IDW hardcover reprints. They mentioned the story that Return of the Jedi had come out, and it's got the Ewoks, who are these cuddly teddy bears. And apparently Hasbro, I don't know if this is pinch of salt stuff, but apparently Hasbro had said to Larry, we want to introduce some new cuddly teddy bear villains into G.I. Joe. And he said it was the first and only, or the only time where he stood his ground and said, absolutely no. It was the only time Hasbro backed down, and they said, well, what are we going to do then? He said, just give me some kind of, Australian biker gang or whatever. So Hasbro went and designed the Dreadnoks, or these Australian bikers, and left it to Larry just to flesh out the whole background for him. So fortunately, we've got the Dreadnoks, who are absolutely ace, and not some cuddly teddy bears.
He would have made that work too, but yeah, I love the Dreadnoks. I loved working on him. I include him in my mini.
Well, I see Buzzer there with throwing down with Roadblock. Is Buzzer the only one, or do we get a few more?
Oh no, he's one of the many. I tried including as many of them as I possibly could without clogging up the works. But I love the Dreadnoks.
It's easy enough to ask the question, who's your favourite Joes? But I'll go the other way. Who's your least favourite Joes or characters?
Least? Well,
in the G.I. Joe world,
use them in my mini.
Right.
So I can't really say. I don't really concentrate on them. In fact, I didn't use enough of them. There's so many others that I like. I'm not terribly familiar with the stuff in the 90s. What was it? The Ninja Force?
Yeah. Ninja Force.
Or something like that. Those look interesting, but I know nothing about them. So I don't know if they're lousy characters. I doubt it. But the low-hanging fruit is that magician sort of Doctor Strange character.
Crystal Ball.
Crystal Ball, yeah, who's written out pretty quickly. But yeah, I don't really.
There was quite a few.
Hate any characters.
There was quite a few weirdos, wasn't there? Crystal Ball, Cesspool was the eco-toxic guy, but he came, like you say, he was in like the 120s, 130s, whatever. Head Raptor was pretty cool.
Raptor, what issues was he in?
He's around the kind of 60s, I think. He's with Fred Seven when he starts donning the battle armor.
He's like in a car half the time.
Yeah.
Is he an IRS or an accountant or something?
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah, with it. Yeah, he is.
Yeah, see, that's perfect. No one wants to draw that guy. Larry Hama's like, I guess I got to work this guy in. So he gave him like a twist that was hilarious, and it was functional. It actually moved the story forward.
Yeah.
So yeah, he could make any character work, and I feel like I have trouble pinpointing characters I don't like, because if anything, I would challenge myself to try to see something redeemable about them, something I could use. Even the Cobra La cast, right? They're hated, right? But I think they look great, and I probably could have done something cool with them.
I think your style,
they don't have to be like the butt of the joke,
Yeah, your style would have worked. Was it Globulus, Pythona, and Nemesis Enforcer? I think it was the three.
Yeah, there were three of them. And man, I could have, thinking about it now, I could have done something. I might still very well do something.
Maybe that's
with them.
Yeah, that's the next series. I'll buy that.
The scope for Sierra Muerte was limited. I only had 3 issues, and it was more of a grounded adventure. Despite that they're like bat robots, and
So you say it's three
And
issues. I mean, is that something? Did you have a story in mind, and then IDW said we're only going to give you 3, or did you say I only need 3?
we worked around that. I mean, it could have been 6, 4. Yeah, at one point it was 1, but I mean that's just the way these things go in scheduling projects. Between what they're used to and what I was capable of. So we landed on 3 issues, and I told the story I wanted to tell in that space.
Cool.
With a very specific tone as well. So something like the Nemesis Enforcer and Company, that would take up another 3 issues if I got the chance, or more, or less. Maybe it's 1 issue. You know, these things are pretty flexible. But for my story, I wanted it to be an action story with a lot of character work. So I wanted it to keep the story moving, keep that sort of momentum moving forward, while taking the right amount of time to flesh out the characters and showcase these people's relationship with one another. You know, the characters that I specifically picked and wanted to draw. So it's a combination of everything. It's who I wanted to write, who I wanted to draw, and how I wanted them to interact with one another, whether it be hero or villain.
And do we get a lot of locations cropping up in this, or is it all based in one area?
Well, it all takes place in Sierra Muerte, which is a neighboring country to Sierra Gordo. Sierra Gordo,
nice.
I mean, the stories told in Sierra Gordo are fantastic. I love them.
Yeah.
They happen around the 70s issues, the numbered 70s. Sierra Muerte, although it was mentioned, they never visited there. As far as I know, they just never did.
Right.
And so I took that opportunity to do that, to flesh out that town, which includes, you know, a swamp, a metropolitan area, a beachside. So, you know, it's a varied country, but they're all there. It's all contained.
Yeah,
you know,
cool.
It's an international Latin American adventure with a secret, you know, shield sort of bases and weaponry, and just kind of like Kirby inspired tech mixed in with you know, urban ninja, a psychedelic mind control thing.
Shit, it's all going on.
Throwing it all into one thing.
Wicked.
Just one canvas. Just
Wicked.
trying to do it. I treated this as if it were the only chance I got to ever work on G.I. Joe, right?
Right.
So I had to
that's
throw
the
it
way
all
to
in.
go,
Yeah, so hopefully it reads like that too, like this sort of like weird fever dream. That's also not too weird. I don't want to, again, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I wanted to sort of utilize the icons as they are in my mind, which stems heavily from the cartoon, you know, because that's what I grew up with. That's how I familiarized myself with these characters. So it has a very clean for me too, has a clean, slick look visually. And then the stories are a little, you know, grounded. They're a little grittier. They're more human-based. So, again, it's just a mix.
Cool. It's a G.I. Joe pop quiz. It's a G.I. Joe pop quiz. Question 3. Nothing much is happening, so you flick on the TV for a little bit of a Saturday evening viewing. There's a celebrity quiz show on. 2 people have made it into the final. Who do you think's got the best general knowledge? Is it Cobra Commander, or is it Fred 7 Cobra Commander?
Probably Fred 7, I'd say.
I guess it depends what the question is.
The main one, he's too self-absorbed to care about anything much.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Fred 7, I think, would dominate.
Cool. In terms of when you're drawing the G.I. Joe book, we know, you know, that Larry is a stickler for realistic military hardware. So, you know, there's stories of artists drawing guns and him sending them back and saying redraw it. What's kind of your take? Are you going for that, or are you from the Liefeld school of weaponry where it's kind of big and, you know, chunky? And what's your take?
The latter. Definitely the latter. Definitely Liefeld by way of Kirby, you know, which really is, like I mentioned him before, but Herb Trimpe, who drew the first year's worth of stories, most of that stuff was just made up weaponry, you know. He wasn't like a stickler. It wasn't like weapon porn, you know.
Yeah.
That crept in way later. And even during the 80s, it wasn't so heavy. I mean, maybe a vehicle here and there, but The original stuff, I just liked the verve of that stuff. You know what I mean? Where it still had leanings in the fantasy realm. By fantasy, I mean just like the bombastic Kirby imagination
Yep.
aspect of it. I don't mean fantasy, of course, but I mean that if
There
it
was
looks
some-
like
there
it could
was
work,
some-
why not? I mean, it's a comic book. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
trying to sort of tap into that, into the fact that these are drawings, you know, and that's sort of like a meta take for myself, just so I could work on this stuff.
Right.
Because as a reader, I'm not necessarily interested in those kind of details. Like if I read a Punisher comic, I'm not going to be one of those readers that writes into the editor complaining that this semi-automatic doesn't really function like that. Because as a reader, I don't really care. That's not part of the story, unless it is. If it's part of the story, then yeah, you have to be sort of very, very faithful to the facts, you know.
Yeah.
But this isn't a historical piece.
And most of those
Right.
early not even early vehicles in GI Joe, the majority of vehicles throughout the run, they weren't just a standard tank or a standard plane. You know, they had some crazy takes on them, and like you say, that kind of Kirby-ish, sci-fi-ish kind of just a twisted take. So it was never, even though it was a grounded in some sense kind of military book, that the goings on around it in the vehicles were not necessarily what you would see on a battlefield in real life.
Right. I think look, there's room for all of it, I think. And it just depends on the kind of story you want to tell and how you want to portray that story. I think everything's fine. You could do a hyper realistic military type of comic and have GI Joe characters serve that story. But I also think you could tell a story where there's a guy running around who's a clone made up of past dictators. You know what I mean? Like, it's just that's sort of the beauty of the soap opera that is GI Joe.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you could have these fantastical, weird elements that only really work in comic books. That's the advantage that comic books have. You just sort of like suspend your disbelief to just enjoy the deeper core of this thing. You don't really, physics don't really work in some of these stories. You know, like the way people act and move, the way bodies react to certain things. It's just, it works or either it doesn't. You know, it just depends on the ultimate experience and what the eventual experience that you want the reader to have.
Yeah.
Right. So my reader, hopefully, will just like the fact that these are human characters responding to certain situations, and they're not caught up with the fact that, well, this strap doesn't really hold this much weight. I don't really care about that stuff. That's not what I get out of comic books. That's certainly not what I get out of G.I. Joe comic books.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, you've only got to look at Tom Scioli's Transformers G.I. Joe comic to that is one of the greatest G.I. Joe comics of all time, in my opinion, and it is just batshit crazy from start to finish.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think Tom's a visionary, and he lent his vision to two really complex properties, and he married them seamlessly. He made it seem like, how could they ever live apart?
Yeah. Because
this is so perfect. And he did his own thing, so it makes sense. There's like a logic behind his vision. And I know what you mean. Like, it just works on its own terms.
Yeah. It shouldn't work,
right?
But
and that's sort of what I'm going for. I'm trying to tap into that sort of freedom of a cartoonist who has that freedom. You know, you're not tied down by anything except your own imagination, right? So we have these avatars in these iconic characters to tell these wild stories. Why not take advantage of that? You know, if part of your vision is getting military aspects correctly, great, that's awesome. Hopefully it'll be a cool story and I'll be able to give a shit. Now for Tom Scioli's book, that's like top of the pile. That is, and now he's doing it with GoBots.
Oh yeah,
so
I've read. I just read the second issue of that. Man, that's another good book. Yeah.
Yeah, he's made me care about the GoBots. You know.
Yeah. Who thought they'd say
he did
that?
The same thing with superpowers. When he was doing those 3-pagers, he reminded us that these characters exist, and they're right there for the taking, and they're hardly being used. And he pretty much eclipsed the main feature, I think. But that sort of spirit is what I think a bunch of us cartoonists have currently. We're applying these wider sensibilities to these kind of iconic, set in stone things. And I think that's a great, potent combination, man. I mean, those are the comics I like to read, and I'm just fortunate to be able to do one like that, to actually work on something like that.
Yeah, I mean, cool. I'm super pumped. I mean, how do you balance, doing your own book and the indie work, and then going and working? Obviously, we didn't even touch about the all new Ultimates book you did at Marvel and stuff. How do you kind of balance all this workload?
Just one by one. I mean, that's why I took a break from COPRA, my own book COPRA, because I wanted to work on Bloodstrike, and then the G.I. Joe thing sort of developed naturally right after that, back to back. So it's really just I can't really juggle too many projects at one time. I have to sort of fully concentrate on one thing. Just give it my all, my complete attention. When I was working for Marvel, that was different. I'm glad I took that job just to see what it felt like to just write and also do my own comic. And it was a lot of work. It just took a lot.
Yeah.
And
would you
that's
go
not
back?
how I approach things these days.
Would you go back and do a Marvel book or a DC book, do you think?
Sure. Yeah, maybe, depending on the conditions and depending on my level of interest. But I'm perfectly happy doing my own stuff. That kind of comes first.
Yeah, that's good.
That kind of comes first. Bloodstrike and G.I. Joe are specific properties that, they're special to me, and I felt like I wanted to use the little window of time that I had in my schedule to work on that. That window just kind of got expanded. It was about almost a year working on this stuff that wasn't mine.
Wow.
But it was the break I needed. I got out of my comfort zone. And I got to work with awesome people in these companies, and essentially to do my own thing, so it's kind of a perfect scenario.
Yeah. Do you
Marvel,
get time to
want to utilize that? Then maybe again, it depends.
Yeah. I mean, do you get time to actually read any comics, doing it in between all this work? And if so, what are you reading at the moment?
I do. I skim a lot of comics.
Yeah.
Collecting comics is like a different beast. I like to bin dive. I like to buy old comics. And new ones too. What's the most recent thing I got? I got, Jason Aaron's Avengers.
Yep.
That's enjoyable. It's like a really fun looking Marvel book. It's great. I mentioned Tom Scioli's GoBots. I've only read the first issue so far.
Okay.
I haven't gotten the second yet. But that's fun. Ed Pisker's X-Men. That's
the
been
Grand
great.
Design
Have you
book.
read that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. They're letting him do what he wants with the X-Men properties. I mean, it's the only X-Men book I'm reading. You know what I mean?
That seems to be a new kind of trend, doesn't it? Especially from the big two, of relaxing a little bit of control and letting creators with a vision kind of do their own thing, which is kind of refreshing.
I mean, as long as it sells, I think that's all they respond to, as they should. They're a business, they're not in this for a hobby or an art form. They're a business. So luckily guys like Ed could sneak in and muscle his way in there and make comics on his own terms. I mean, that's great. More of that, please. And if you think about it, all the classic comics that we all love from the past kind of operated under the same conditions. You let someone loose. That's how you get like an Alan Moore.
Yeah.
That's how you cultivate that sort of talent. Not under scrutiny, not under, not by committee, polite committee. Nothing political going on. You just make a thing, and that's sort of how I operate. Especially with COPRA, it's just a more immediate, raw, direct thing between me and the reader, and that's it. No middleman, right? Yeah. Except the stores, obviously, but it's just a pure, direct line to my form of expression. It's just what I want to do. It's the kind of book I want to put out there, and hopefully the readers want that. Because that's what I look for in other creators, like like the guys I mentioned, Tom and Ed, Chuck Forsman doing the same thing with his Revenger comic. That's another comic I highly recommend.
Okay, I've not read that.
Revenger's one of the best action comics in the past 10 years. And it's one guy doing it all, you know?
One vision.
If you guys aren't familiar with Chuck Forsman, he's the guy who created The End of the Fucking World.
Right.
Now on Netflix.
Okay. Yeah.
But he did an adventure comic called Revenger. And it's fantastic.
I'll check that out.
You guys should definitely, whoever's listening should definitely check that out.
Cool. Last couple of questions. I know we've kept you a long time. Really appreciate that. Do you think we'll ever see you over in the UK at a convention? Thought Bubble, I think, in Leeds is right up your alley. They have a great selection of big name artists and creators, as well as indie guys and small press guys, and I think that'd be right up your alley. Is that something you'd be interested in maybe at some point?
I'd love to go. I've been wanting to go for years.
Okay.
But my schedule doesn't really allow for it, and it's a little tricky.
Yeah.
I have to stay stateside, and even stateside, I'm only really doing one convention a year at this point.
Wow.
But Thought Bubble, that's definitely on my list. I want to make it over there. If not for Thought Bubble, then definitely for a store. I mean, Gosh is a great store. They've been huge supporters of mine.
Cool. Oh, do they stock the book, do they? Because I pop into Gosh every now and again, and it's just never even thought to cross my mind to look for COPRA. But if they stock it, then I'm going to pop in there, yeah. They
got it. They have all the volumes. They should have Bloodstrike, too. They probably have Zegas, which is my other book for Fantagraphics. They should have it all. They're really huge supporters. I really appreciate them.
Wicked. Excellent.
Yeah.
It's a G.I. Joe pop quiz. It's a G.I. Joe pop quiz. Last question for... you don't know what to do, you're bored. It seems a lot of these questions where you're bored, there's nothing to do. Anyway, you're bored, you've popped down to the local video game arcade. There's a big crowd. They've gathered around the Pac-Man machine. There's two people playing, head to head. Who's going to get the highest score on Pac-Man? Is it Hawk or is it Serpentor?
Hold on. One quick question.
Yeah.
Is it Miss Pac-Man or is it Pac-Man?
Oh, shit. Ms. Pac-Man was the bomb, wasn't it? It's Ms. Pac-Man, yeah. Why not?
It's definitely Hawk.
Yeah?
It's definitely Hawk. Serpentor wouldn't even know what to do looking at a screen.
He would probably just smash that up, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he wouldn't make it past the first round.
Okay.
No, but Hawk, he would totally dominate. And okay. I'm a big Ms. Pac-Man fan, so I would know.
Nice. Listeners out there, if you like Michel's answers to the 4 pop quiz questions, let us know. If you think he got them all wrong, let us know, and we'll feed that back to him. Just want to say thanks again for coming on the show. Where can people find you if they want to check out your stuff? Where can they go?
You can always find news and updates on michelfiffe.com, or just follow me on social media at Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. I'm there under my own name. So just seek me out, and let's talk about some old comics or something.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I mean, later on in the year, and look, you're so busy. I just had a thought. Later on in the year, if you get a free half an hour and you want to come back on the show while we do one of our rereads and cover a couple of issues, you're more than welcome.
Awesome, good to know. Yeah,
cool.
I'd love to reread some of that stuff.
Excellent. Again, thanks for our brilliant guest, Michel Fiffe, and we will catch you all down the road with the next episode. No.